The gold-leafed gates of the Royal Lodge have finally been locked, not against an outside intruder, but against the very man who called it home for decades. In a cold, sharp, and unprecedented move that has sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom, King Charles III has officially signed the order to withdraw the final layers of security and residential support for his younger brother, Prince Andrew. This wasn't a routine administrative update. It was a systemic reset, a king and his heir, Prince William, standing side by side, finally admitting that the era of royal leniency for the Duke of York has reached its absolute breaking point. For years, the Royal Lodge served as Andrew's fortress, a 30-room sanctuary in Windsor Great Park that symbolized his stubborn refusal to fade into the background after the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. But as of the 19th of January 2026, the palace machine has decided to stop managing the optics and start controlling the reality. The silence that once shielded Andrew has been replaced by a doctrine of duty that leaves no room for those who do not serve the crown. I've watched this pattern in every fragile institution that's more afraid of truth than of scandal. But this move feels different. It's a turning point where the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages survival. The Duke, who once believed his birthright made him untouchable, now faces a reality where even his private security team has been told to stand down, leaving the mortal side of the monarchy exposed to the world. This isn't just about a property dispute or the high cost of guarding a disgraced prince. It is about who gets to own the story of the House of Windsor. By removing the security, the king has effectively removed the mask of royal protection. Behind the historic stone walls, the gears of the institution have shifted, and the fairy tale monarchy that Andrew clung to has been replaced by a cold, political calculation. Why did it take this long for the king to be this honest? Perhaps because the king realized that a monarchy that hides its cracks behind beautiful paintings will eventually see its walls crumble under the weight of secrecy. As the sun sets on Andrew's tenure at Royal Lodge, the question isn't just where he will go, but what his exile reveals about the future of the crown. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that demands transparency, it can no longer afford to pretend that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. Andrew didn't just lose his home today, he lost the monarchy's script. The withdrawal of Prince Andrew's security isn't just a logistical change. It is a formal declaration of moral bankruptcy for his brand within the firm. For decades, the Duke of York operated under the comfortable assumption that his status as the king's brother provided a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card, both in the eyes of the law and in the geography of the royal estates. But as the internal audits for the Duchy of Cornwall and the sovereign grant were finalized in early 2026, a devastating truth emerged that the palace could no longer ignore. The crown cannot justify the millions of pounds spent annually on guarding a non-working royal, whose presence brings only reputational decay and public resentment. King Charles has officially authorized the cessation of the £3 million annual security allowance that had been privately funded since Andrew's ignominious exit from public life. This move marks the strict implementation of the first pillar of the doctrine of duty: no funding without absolute accountability. In years past, the king's parental softness and brotherly loyalty might have allowed for a quiet compromise, a way to keep Andrew protected without making a scene. But the pressure from the Prince of Wales, William, has been unrelenting and mathematically precise. William views Andrew not as a family member to be sheltered, but as a structural liability to the very survival of the institution he will one day inherit. For William, every pound spent on Andrew is a pound stolen from the monarchy's future legitimacy. The Royal Lodge, a 30-room sanctuary once a symbol of Queen Elizabeth II's enduring love for her favorite son, has now been transformed into the epicenter of a cold, high-stakes constitutional battle. Andrew is not just fighting to keep his home, he is fighting to maintain the crumbling illusion that he is still a somebody in the eyes of the state. However, by severing the security cord, King Charles has effectively declared Andrew a private citizen who is living on borrowed time and borrowed grace. The message from the Privy Council and Kensington Palace is echoing through the halls of Windsor. The sanctuary is closed, and the royal umbrella has been folded. Why has this happened now? because the public's tolerance for royal shielding has finally reached its expiration point. In an era where every penny of public and duchy wealth is scrutinized by a global audience, guarding a man linked to the darkest corners of international scandal is no longer a sustainable PR strategy. It is a strategic withdrawal designed to protect the king and the heir from the fallout of Andrew's past. As Princess Anne reportedly noted in a private memorandum to the Royal Stewardship Board, sentimentality cannot be allowed to override our primary obligation of royal stewardship. Andrew's isolation is the necessary sacrifice on the altar of the crown's survival. This is the beginning of a historic shift in how business is conducted at Windsor. The mask of familial protection hasn't just slipped. It has been torn away by a king who realizes that to save the monarchy, he must first prune the branches that have become toxic. Prince Andrew is the first casualty of this new, cold reality. But as the doctrine of duty takes hold, he certainly won't be the last to feel the chill of exile. The transition from being the king's brother to a private citizen isn't just a matter of paperwork. It is a brutal, physical reality that has now materialized at the entrance of Royal Lodge. In this new era of the doctrine of duty, the palace isn't just sending emails. They are changing the locks. The sight of specialized security teams packing up their gear and leaving the 30-room estate is the most visible confession the monarchy has ever made. It is the moment the fairy tale ends and the cold machinery of the state takes over. For Prince Andrew, this isn't just about losing a residence. It is about the collapse of the royal umbrella that has shielded him from the consequences of his actions for a lifetime. I've analyzed these institutional patterns for over a decade, and what we are seeing is a strategic eviction of the monarchy's most toxic element. The King and the Prince of Wales are no longer interested in protecting the person. They are entirely focused on preserving the perception. When a public institution silences its own family to protect its survival, it isn't a sign of cruelty. It's a survival instinct. Think of the monarchy as an ancient castle with massive, historic walls. For years, Andrew was a crack in that wall that the palace tried to hide by hanging beautiful, polished paintings over it. But the paintings have fallen, and the cracks have become too deep to ignore. King Charles has finally realized that you cannot save a crumbling house by pretending the damage isn't there. By withdrawing the security and blocking access, the palace is finally looking directly at the vessel of scandal and deciding that the cost of repair is far higher than the cost of a complete reset. This physical siege is also a psychological one. Andrew has spent his life believing that birthright is a permanent shield, but he is discovering that in the 21st century, the crown is a lease that requires the payment of public trust, a currency he has long since spent. As the final royal guards depart, the Duke of York is left standing in the echo of his own 30 rooms, realizing that the gates are closed not just to the public, but to him. The monarchy has moved on. The gears of the castle clock have turned, and for the man who refused to leave, time has finally run out. The withdrawal of security from Royal Lodge is not merely a financial decision. It is an attempt by King Charles and Prince William to perform an institutional exorcism. For years, the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein has hung over the House of Windsor like a toxic fog, refusing to dissipate despite the numerous legal settlements and official retirements. In this new era of the doctrine of duty, the palace has finally admitted that you cannot preserve a royal brand while simultaneously guarding a man whose name is forever linked to one of the darkest scandals of the 21st century. By removing the protective ring of security, the king is effectively letting the cold light of the public archive fall directly onto his brother, without the filter of royal privilege. I've spent years observing how these institutions manage problematic assets, and what we are seeing now is the final failure of the palace's containment strategy. For a long time, the strategy was silence, and space give Andrew a fortress to hide in, and hope the world forgets. But silence in a public institution isn't a vacuum. It's a breeding ground for suspicion. Every time a news ticker mentioned the Epstein archives, the Royal Lodge became a physical reminder of the Crown's perceived complicity in shielding its own. The king has realized that the ermine robes of the monarchy cannot remain white if they are constantly used to cover up stains that refuse to wash away. From a psychological perspective, look at the physiognomy of defeat appearing on the Duke. In recent, rare glimpses, we see a man whose defiant tilt of the chin has been replaced by the heavy, sagging lines of a permanent exile. These external signs of stress are not just the result of age. They are the physical manifestation of an internal decay of status. He looks like a man who realizes that his birthright was actually a contract, and he has been found in total breach. The public doesn't just see a disgraced prince. They see a contemptible figure who expected the taxpayer to fund his safety while he lived in a 30-room sanctuary of his own making. This is the truth, dragged out at the last possible moment. The king didn't pull the security because he stopped loving his brother. He pulled it because he realized that guarding Andrew was becoming a suicide mission for the monarchy's own reputation. In the unforgiving archive of the internet, the connection between Andrew and Epstein is permanent. By severing the security cord, the palace is trying to tell the world, we are no longer his shield. They are moving from a strategy of protection to a strategy of survival, even if it means leaving a family member exposed to the cold winds of history. The fortress has fallen, and the shadow has finally won. While the public sees the cold precision of legal notices and security withdrawals, the emotional epicenter of this crisis resides in the quiet corridors of Windsor Chapel. On the morning of the 15th of January 2026, King Charles III was observed in solitary reflection, a monarch reportedly shaken by the necessity of the very orders he had to sign. This is the ultimate tragedy of the modern crown, the moment where the heart of a brother must be surgically removed to protect the head of the sovereign. Charles is no longer just a sibling to Andrew. He is the lead steward of a 1,000-year-old institution that can no longer afford the luxury of family loyalty. Behind this decision lies the doctrine of duty, a systemic reset orchestrated by Prince William and Princess Anne to end the Sussex and York exceptions once and for all. This framework established 4 rigid pillars: no property without purpose, no funding without accountability, no rebranding of the crown for private gain, and no re-entry without restoration. By applying these rules to Andrew, Charles has effectively dismantled the sanctuary of the Royal Lodge. The king finally understands that love cannot be leveraged to override duty. This isn't a temporary punishment. It is a permanent closure of the half-in, half-out model that Andrew tried to sustain for years. We can see the toll of this decision not just in palace documents, but in the physiognomy of the king himself. Observers note a monarch who appears emotionally fatigued, his posture weighed down by the burden of exiling his own blood. In the world of royal analysis, these physical signs are the map of an internal war, a king who loves his brother but fears the cracks in the castle walls more than the pain of a family rift. Charles has realized that a monarchy is like a great clock. If one gear, no matter how close to the center, becomes rusted and begins to jam the mechanism, it must be removed, or the entire system will stop. The Royal Lodge has become the test case for this new era of transparency. By refusing to contest William's legal objections and Anne's unyielding stance on royal stewardship, Charles has chosen the crown over the Yorks. The fairy tale of the untouchable prince has been replaced by the doctrine of the accountable citizen. The doors of the House of Windsor are no longer opened by emotional appeals. They are locked by the cold requirement of public trust. Andrew's isolation is the physical proof that in 2026, the monarchy has decided it can no longer bleed for those who will not serve. The final withdrawal of Prince Andrew's security detail is not just a personal blow. It is the physical manifestation of the most significant constitutional shift in the modern era, the doctrine of duty. This framework, meticulously designed by Prince William and Princess Anne, has effectively rewritten the royal script from one of familial protection to institutional survival. For decades, the monarchy functioned like an ancient mansion where the staff spent all their time hanging beautiful, polished paintings over the growing cracks in the walls to keep the public from seeing the decay. But King Charles has finally realized that a house held together by secrecy and wallpaper will eventually collapse under its own weight. The Duke of York is currently experiencing what I call the architecture of exclusion. By removing the security cord and blocking access to royal funding, the palace is using the royal lodge as a test case for a no more hiding policy. This isn't just about the high cost of guarding a disgraced prince. It is about the cost of silence. In a public institution, silence is never neutral. It is a shield for the privileged. By dropping that shield, the king is forcing his brother to face the same reality as any other citizen, one where dignity is earned through service, not granted by birthright. You can see the reality of this transition written on Andrew's face. In the world of royal analysis, we look at the physiognomy of stress, those deep lines of worry, and the sagging posture of a man who realizes his ermine robes have been permanently stripped away. These external signs are not just about age. They are the physical map of an internal status collapse. He looks like a man who finally understands that the royal umbrella was a lease, and the landlord has finally decided not to renew it. The monarchy under King Charles is moving away from the fairy tale model that Andrew clung to for so long. It is becoming a lean, modern machine that views humanity versus the institution as its most critical battle. If a future king like William has to choose between protecting his uncle or protecting the crown, the uncle will be discarded every single time to ensure the institution doesn't bleed out in the eyes of the public. The gates are closed because the crown can no longer afford to let the vessel of scandal remain inside the fortress. The exclusion of Prince Andrew from the royal lodge signifies more than just a change in address. It is the final destruction of the myth of the royal return. For years, the Duke of York operated under the delusion that if he simply waited long enough in the shadows, the public's memory would fade, and the palace would eventually find a path for his restoration to public life. But the implementation of the doctrine of duty has officially sealed that door. This new institutional framework, enforced by King Charles and championed by Prince William, establishes a cold, non-negotiable reality. There is no re-entry into the royal circle without a total, transparent restoration of public trust, a feat that, in Andrew's case, is now viewed as a mathematical impossibility. I've analyzed the physiognomy of the outcast in these high-stakes power transitions. If you look closely at recent footage of the Duke, you don't just see a man who has aged. You see the physical map of a status collapse. The heavy lines around the eyes and the rigid, defensive posture are the external markers of someone who has realized that his birthright was not an ironclad shield, but a lease on public grace that has been terminated for cause. He looks like a man who has finally seen the mask of the monarchy slip, revealing not a protective family, but a clinical, self-preserving machine. This isn't just a family disagreement. It is a test case for the survival of a 1,000-year-old institution in a transparent century. The palace has realized that to survive, the monarchy can no longer be a sanctuary for those who bleed the institution's credibility. For decades, the strategy was to hide the cracks in the castle walls by hanging beautiful, historic paintings over them. But the king and his heir have decided that the paintings are no longer enough. To save the house, they must prune the branches that have become toxic, regardless of the blood ties. The doctrine of duty ensures that the era of royal exceptions is over. Andrew is discovering that in 2026, the crown is no longer a fairy tale of untouchable privilege. It is a corporate-style entity where loyalty is strictly secondary to utility and integrity. By removing his security and his home, the king is telling the world that the monarchy's moral compass has finally been reset. The road back to the center is not just long, it is gone. The Duke is no longer a prince in waiting. He is a man standing outside the gates of a history that has already moved on without him. The exile of Prince Andrew from the Royal Lodge is not merely a palace intrigue. It is the final verdict of the British public, executed by a king who has finally learned to read the room. For decades, the monarchy operated on a don't ask, don't tell policy regarding the private failings of its senior members. But as the final security detail departs from Windsor Great Park, that era of protective silence has officially been declared bankrupt. In this systemic reset, King Charles and Prince William are no longer just managing a family. They are managing a brand that is under constant, unforgiving surveillance by a global audience. I've analyzed the physiognomy of public sentiment for over a decade. And what we are seeing is a massive shift in what the public is willing to fund. The taxpayer is no longer interested in paying for the ermine-trimmed shielding of a man whose name is permanently linked to the Epstein archives. By withdrawing Andrew's security and housing privileges, the king has finally aligned the crown with the verdict of the streets. This move is a recognition that in the 21st century, the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages the survival of its legitimacy. Think of the doctrine of duty as a new constitutional filter. It is no longer enough to be born royal. One must be functionally royal to receive the protection of the state. The king has realized that every pound spent on guarding Andrew was a pound subtracted from the public's trust in the institution. This wasn't an act of brotherly cruelty. It was a clinical, high-stakes political calculation. The mask of the monarchy didn't just slip. It was removed to show the world that the crown can bleed, but it will not bleed out for the sake of a disgraced prince. The Royal Lodge has become a monument to the cost of secrecy. For years, the palace tried to hide the cracks in the walls by hanging historic paintings of family unity over Andrew's scandals. But the paintings have been taken down, and the cracks are now the only thing people see. As Andrew stands alone in his 30 rooms, he is discovering that the most expensive thing a royal can own is a history that they cannot explain. The king has made his choice. He has chosen the future of the crown over the comfort of his brother, and in doing so, he has finally told the truth to the people who still believe the monarchy must mean something more than just survival. The strategic eviction of Prince Andrew from Royal Lodge is not merely the conclusion of a singular family feud, it is the official activation of a new, permanent protocol that will govern the House of Windsor for the next century. This is the doctrine of duty in its most clinical and unforgiving form. By stripping the Duke of York of his final layers of state-sanctioned protection, King Charles III and Prince William have sent a clear, chilling message to every member of the royal bloodline. Birthright is no longer a shield against accountability. The era of the untouchable royal ended the moment the security teams pulled away from the lodge, leaving the Duke as a cautionary tale for any who believe that their title is a permanent pass for moral or financial liability. I've watched the internal gears of this institution turn for years, and this is the first time the palace machine has prioritized the integrity of the crown over the comfort of its own flesh and blood. In the past, the monarchy operated like an ancient clock that was allowed to keep running even if a few of its gears were rusted, so long as the face remained polished. But the king has realized that a rusted gear will eventually jam the entire mechanism, especially when the public is watching every movement with increasing skepticism. Andrew's isolation is the necessary pruning of a branch that has become toxic to the tree. From a psychological perspective, this move signals a transition from immunity to accountability. For decades, Andrew lived in a reality where the mask of the monarchy was a literal wall that kept the consequences of his actions at bay. But as the security vanished, so did the illusion of his exceptionalism. If you look at the physiognomy of this status collapse, you see a man who hasn't just lost a home. He has lost his identity as a sovereign being. He is discovering that without the uniform and the guards, he is simply an aging man in a very large, very quiet house that no longer belongs to his future. This isn't just a warning for Andrew, it is a blueprint for the future heirs, including George, Charlotte, and Louis. The king is establishing that the monarchy of the 21st century is a lease of trust, not a divine right. If a member of the inner circle cannot uphold the moral weight of the crown, they will be removed from the sanctuary, regardless of how many paintings of their ancestors hang on the walls. The Royal Lodge is now the physical proof that the fairy tale has been replaced by a doctrine of survival. The gates are closed because the crown can no longer afford to be a sanctuary for those who refuse to serve the people who fund their existence. The sun has finally set on the era of royal exceptionalism, leaving Prince Andrew standing in the long, cold shadows of a 30-room fortress that is no longer his sanctuary. The withdrawal of his security and the locking of the Royal Lodge gates represent more than a family eviction. They represent the definitive end of the fairy tale monarchy. King Charles III and Prince William have officially signaled that the crown can no longer afford to be a museum of protected scandals. By choosing institutional integrity over the preservation of a disgraced brother, the king has performed the most difficult surgery in the history of the House of Windsor. He has cut away a toxic limb to ensure the body survives. This wasn't just about a property dispute or a security budget. It was a system finally forced to admit it can bleed. For decades, the palace tried to manage the optics by hanging historic paintings of unity over the cracks in the castle walls. But those cracks became craters, and the silence that once shielded the Duke became a weapon used against the crown's own legitimacy. In this 2026 reset, the doctrine of duty has replaced the protocol of privacy. The monarchy has transitioned from an institution that hides its wounds to one that realizes transparency is its only path to survival in a century that demands accountability. Andrew now stands as the ultimate cautionary tale, a man who believed his birthright was an ironclad shield, only to find that in the modern world, the crown is a lease of public trust that can be terminated for cause. As the final royal guards depart, the Duke is left with nothing but the echo of his own 30 rooms and a legacy that has been stripped of its ermine-trimmed protection. The message to the world is clear. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched the Sussex and York scandals unfold in real time, it cannot go back to pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The gates of Royal Lodge are now closed, not out of cruelty, but out of a clinical necessity to protect the future of the king and his heir. The House of Windsor has moved from a privacy-first machine to a duty-first institution, proving that even a prince can be made mortal when the survival of the state is at risk. This is the final verdict of the sovereign. Love for a brother does not justify the compromise of a 1,000-year-old mission. The sanctuary is gone. The shield has been folded, and the doors to the past have been irrevocably sealed.